is I have made a quilt for a very good friend of mine. And what I'm wanting to do is to show you how I do binding, but also binding with a flange. Now, what I've done here is quite simply, I've looked at a panel. I've got a panel over here, but then what happens with borders is somebody once told me that your borders must always be an odd number in the Fibonacci sequence. True or not, I don't know. So here we've got 1 border, 2 borders, 3 borders, 4 borders, 5 borders, and then the binding was going to be my 6th border. And that lady's mind words have been flowing in my mind, so I decided to put a flange on. Now, what many people don't know how to put a flange on, so what I wanted to do was to show you what it looks like. Now, over here you can see they overlap each other as you go along. The direction in which you overlap them is your call. I just try and be consistent all the way through. So I thought what I would do is show you how I do this as a quilt. Now, there are many more professional people than I who will go along and put the flange on first with 1/8 of an inch, stitch that all the way around. I am too busy. I have too much going on, so I do it together. Now you can see here, I've got my flange lined up with the raw edge of my quilt, and then I've got my binding on top of the flange. So what I'm doing there is I'm holding it in place, and I'm then sewing down the line 1/4 of an inch. So what that looks like when I've done it is you can see over here, you've still got the flange here. Now the flange, what I've done, I've taken an inch piece of fabric, I've pressed it in half, and then I've just sewn them together end to end, straight end to straight end. That's all I've done. Press the seams open and we are ready to go. The binding, I've done that on the diagonal as you normally do. And here we go. I love binding quilts. It's the end of the process. And I'm very lucky because when I get to bind a quilt for a client or a friend, I'm the first person under the quilt that gets warm under the quilt, which I think is a great privilege because technically you're then the first person to have used the quilt. This does take a little bit longer, I suppose, than normal binding by making sure that the flange is lined up. But as I said previously, you're welcome to go and stitch the flange on first using 1/8 of an inch seam rather than 1/4 of an inch. That will work absolutely fine. You must do what works for you. The trick comes when you come to the corners and the ends. So we're almost done here. We're about 1/3 of the way through the last row. And you can see it is once you get into a rhythm, it's quite easy to do. And I'm keeping everything lined up about 4 inches past my sewing machine. Now you can do multiple flanges. The most I've done, I think, was 6. It does get a little bit bulky when you're stitching those all down. If you are doing more than 3 flanges, I do suggest that you do tack them on. And obviously you then increase them by the increment of 1/2 inch as you go along, or 1 inch, or whatever you want to do it as. Personally, I think 6 flanges was a little excessive. It did look amazing, but that's not for me. But whatever the client wants, the client gets. So we're a little bit over halfway now. Now I don't use binding clips or anything here. I just find they get in the way. It doubles the work. I just take it nice and slowly, stitching these down. And having an industrial machine, I can go a little bit, I can have more layers and go a little thicker. And now we're coming to the end, the edge. I'm going to just stitch a bit closer to there to make it easier to manage. Okay, almost there. We'll do it. I do this to about 2 inches, 3 inches to the end. Okay, so what I do now is I fold my binding back. This is my flange, and I'm literally just lining it up against the quilt to check that I've got it. I don't want there to be any ripples or any bulk. And then I trim off the bit that I don't need so that it lines up to the end of the quilt. But then what you need to do on this side is obviously you've got another piece over here, and that needs to go underneath this piece here. So what I'm going to do there is I'm going to line that up like that, and then again trim off my excess. So you can see that when I've finished it, it will still have that fold over it, okay? So the tacking of this, it just takes a little bit more, bear with. Okay, so now what I've done, you can see I've now stitched the binding in place. I've got those over each other. So the binding, you take like that, and we're going to now stitch to 1/4 inch to the edge. This is how you do all of the corners of your binding. I leave my needle down, I then lift my foot up and I rotate it. Now I use the double seam tape here, which is the stitch line that I have. And what I've done is my needle is at that 1/4 inch point of the machine here. You can see where my needle is there. And when I drop the foot down, you can see that's at 1/4 inch. And I'm now going to sew in a straight line to the very corner of my quilt. Okay, so you can see there, that's what I've done there. But now by doing that, I've attached the flange as well. So that's an added bonus. So when I do that, I then take this piece of fabric and I fold it up this way so that the line from this edge of the quilt to the binding is completely in a row. And then I fold this back on itself that the line here is exactly the same. And then I check that this piece of fabric is in a line. So you've lined up this edge, and that edge. And when you've done that, you fold this round, you turn this round to your sewing machine, and you then stitch from the edge of the quilt onto it from there. Now, I have already gone and sewn all the way along the quilt all the way around. Okay, so I've got this little bit here. Now this is the bit where everybody gets confused. So the way I do it is I cut the edge of my binding off, okay? And then I use this because this is the size of your binding. And what I do here is making sure everything's flat. I take that and I check, okay, so I don't want to have too much bulk of the binding, so I just cut off bits of the binding here, okay? So that's my leftover binding for another quilt. So what I'm going to do here is you make a decision. You're going to sew these together, and you're going to sew them that deep apart. So I'm going to pick I'm going to do halfway between the two. So I'm going to cut that bit there, so that'll be the edge of my binding one, the bottom binding. And then if I put that on top of it, and I fold that back there, that'll be my overlap. So this, I'm not using a ruler, I'm using the actual fabric to do it. And then I'm trimming that bit off, okay? So basically all I've done is this is going to be that much bigger than this piece over here, all right? So then what you do, just like you do with normal binding, you take these two together, you put them right sides together, and you're going to sew from that corner to this corner over here. Now remember, you've got a large bulk of fabric. Take your time, there's no rush. And you're going to put that under here. And what I do is I stitch 1 or 2 stitches, leave my needle down because then I make sure that the fabric's in place. And then I unfold that bottom piece of binding. And I make sure that the line of the bindings are on top of each other. So you can see there, they're all on top of each other. And I make sure that using my double-edged tape, I sew in a straight line across there. Okay, so all I've done is I've sewn in a straight line across there. Now in theory, when I pull this back, voila, it all works. Don't trim this off until you've checked you've done it correctly. Often I have done this and you end up accidentally having stitched something the wrong way round, or it's not quite right and you've got a little bit of flap. It just makes it easier to do that. Now, obviously, we've still got our flange in place. So all I'm going to do now is line everything up. And I leave my needle down just to make sure that everything's all completely lined up after doing 2 or 3 stitches. And there we go. We now have a fully bound quilt with a flange. And when you come to then do your binding over here, what we're going to do here, I have used binding that is 2 3/4 wide because I like my binding where you fold it in half and then you fold it back over here. And I find that that extra 1/8 of an inch that you get, make sure it hides any of your extra seams on here. And now this beautiful quilt is off to go and live with its new family in its new home. And I am so excited to be able to share this with you today. Thank you all so much. Have a good one. Catch up with you soon. Bye-bye.